And so now hopefully we're actually live. All right, so I think this one, I believe we never looked at. Or did we? I don't think we did.
If you did, I'm not aware of it.
Yeah. Nope. I got tagged a million times for not doing my job, but other than that, I don't think I ever responded to it.
You make me remember all the way back to April 18th.
Oh, you think that's bad? We sometimes review issues that were filed 3 years ago. Yeah, I apologize. Like we basically went through the nullability reviews and we basically preempted this meeting a few times in a row, and so we never looked at the backlog. All right, so I believe what we did review was hierarchical instead of W3C feature at some point. And I suppose this is just an API that allows you to set the format ID for a particular instance of the activity.
Yeah, like today when you create an activity, if you didn't call this proposed API, there's a bunch of sort of rules in the start method of activity that determine what format of ID you're going to get. Like it looks at the parent, and it looks at a static, and it looks at some defaults, and based on 4 or 5 different conditionals, it figures out what kind of ID you should have.
Right.
This one is basically a way to just trump all of it and just say, this is exactly the format that I want, and I know what I'm doing. Give me that.
So why is it not just a property? Why is it an actual method?
So I think part of it is that there's a little pattern on activity that this is following. The other part of it is, I think it is doing a bit of validation because you're only allowed to call this prior to calling start. And I don't recall if there's any other good reason. I think the main one is just this already seems to be a pre-existing pattern on activity. Like there's there's like a set parent ID, for example.
Right. I mean, they're also properties, but I think they're all...
Yeah, the properties are exclusively getters. The setters have all been... The setters aren't there.
The setters have to be called before some other method that makes sense.
Yeah. If you guys think we should switch to properties, I mean,
right now you can't retrieve it either,
take
right?
That
the
feedback,
format,
look at it, but
so the format ID you can't retrieve right now, right? There's no way for you.
What was that?
There's a getter.
Oh, there's an ID format. Yes, here we go.
Yeah. Yeah, so you can do the getter after you call this, and it should return what you set.
I mean, you have at least one setter, which is activity trace flags, as far as I can tell. There's also force default ID form, but that's a static. But the rest seems to be get set. Yeah, in general, I don't think we have a rule that forbids properties if you have to call them before a method, because that's a pattern that we have in other classes in the framework.
Yeah.
What we try to avoid is like having dependencies of setters themselves. So it would be bad to say property X has to be set before property Y. Right? Properties should generally be settable independently of each other. But once you set them, it's okay to say you can only call a method. Once the state is completely valid. That's usually not what we do. I don't know. It seems like a property makes more sense to me. Seems weird to have a method here, but. Why?
So, how much do you...
that have context. I think we should never add any more of them again. And in fact, it's one of the things on my notes for updating framework design guidelines is don't pick a property or don't use a property if it can't be freely set.
It does make it a little bit more verbose to instantiate such an object, because if you call the object constructor, you can use the nice property initializer syntax if the properties are settable. But I mean, minor inconvenience, right?
Really, I mean, it's either a property bag or it's a stateful thing. and it shouldn't be a mix of both.
I think it depends on the object. Like, I mean, for the most part, like I've not seen any issues with that pattern. But I think the question really is for this particular method here, like what makes more sense. I've worked with EventDog, I've worked with process, and I generally don't have a problem with that pattern. The most annoying thing is for the most part that having methods that throw and properties aren't set can be annoying, but usually the exception message tells you exactly what you have to fix. So I don't think that's that bad. It's just in those cases you'd rather have them taken in as arguments, so you know that you have to supply.
And definitely, I mean, of course, pre-existing convention is that start is not going to throw, regardless whether you call that method or not. It's just, if you didn't call it, then it's going to go and do some other set of rules to figure out what it should be.
So,
and if you did call it, then that overrides everything else.
Why not do the constructor overload?
I'm fine with it. I don't know anything about this. Like, everything I know about the APIs on the screen.
My recollection, I'm trying to bring up, I mean, I think there was some discussion in that thread, and I'm trying to find it and bring it all up, is that mostly it's that way because that just mirrored the pattern of some pre-existing API that's already in that class.
Okay.
But I'm trying to bring up the rest of that thread and skim it and try and remember if there was more reasons why it's that way and not a different way.
I mean, the only odd ones really are set end time and set start time. All the other ones are basically taking more arguments, so it makes sense to have them as methods. But I don't care strongly enough about this API being a method or not.
If it is a method, it should be called setID format instead of setFormatID.
I would agree with that. You want to mirror the property, basically.
Yeah, you're right. I'm not sure how it ended. It said format ID.
Probably just a typo.
Totally on board with making it ID format.
What is this?
Yeah, it could be convinced to do the explicit set method, especially since you seem, Jeremy, pretty strongly.
Yeah, I mean,
you have strongly held beliefs about this.
Yeah, like the closest that we have to a written guideline is that property should be able to be set in any.
Yeah. Which I think is generally the only sensible thing. Properties themselves, if they have interdependencies, it's impossible to reason about it.
Yeah.
I think a design is a lot cleaner when the things with settable properties are configuration, things with methods are actors, and if it needs to be changeable like this one, like we have a much cleaner way of documenting on the method. This must be called before start. It'll throw in our invalid operation exception if start has already been called. We can do that on the property too. It's just way out there.
Yeah, sorry, maybe I missed a second ago. Why not put it in the constructor or in start itself?
So there was a conversation in the thread about putting it in the constructor, and it seemed that no one really. So the only person, it seems, who's commented on the thread or in this room who actually has a strong opinion is Jeremy.
Let's just don't make it.
And all the rest of us, including the folks in the thread, it seems, are just kind of like.
Because so the advantage of putting it in the constructor or in the start method is that it guarantees that you're setting it at the right time.
Yeah.
Property or separate method suffers from people will make mistakes.
I don't think it makes sense to put in the start method because it is really configuration.
Yeah.
Which means it really should be a constructor or something settable before start.
Like a one-time thing.
There's also, for the start method, there's also this pattern with the diagnostics listener where you don't directly call start on the activity. You basically ask the diagnostics listener to start the activity on your behalf.
Okay.
So at least if you went down that route, you would also need to overload that API to have multiple variations where you do and do not pass the new argument. I mean, it's doable. It just means there's more APIs that need to be touched. I'm just trying to skim through this thread and see if I could find anything that was.
Yeah, I think it would make sense to put it as a parameter in the constructor, or if these are created from some other method somewhere and returned as child instances off of a thing.
Here's there's a little bit more. There was a little more feedback from Ludmilla, who was also talking about the set ID format. If basically the person who calls that method to set it might not be the same person as the entity that constructed it and calls start. As in, because of the diagnostic listener, this object gets handed out to a tracing system, and the tracing system could actually call the API on the object, which then goes back to the original, guy who constructed it to call start.
Yeah.
What's the behavior of this method if force default ID format is true?
I believe what we agreed on is this method wins. As in, even if you've said force default ID, that this thing still wins.
Then what's the point of forcing a format?
The force is basically as a process-wide setting. As in, there's like an order of precedence, and there's a default that you're going to get. And there's a default, there's a parent, there's the force, and then there's this API in order from least to most precedence, I think.
Right, looking at the code, it's force default is first, then parent span ID set, then parent ID, and then default again, but non-force.
Yeah, so the idea was this just comes in at the head of the chain, takes the most precedence if you've done it.
So it seems like from all the options we considered, like method seems to be the one that we can agree with the most, and a separate method that is not tied to the other method also seems reasonable. Like, I don't quite understand the proposal that Miller proposed with like parent ID and default ID format, and one of them can be null. It seems very weird. I would just make them a separate method at that point. It's a separate concern. All right, anybody, any objections to the method set ID format then? Let's just do that.
For what it's worth, the only two properties that this has that are settable can be set after. So this would have been the other that had to be set.
Okay. That's a good argument for a method then.
All right, so
great.
Sweet. So this is done. So then the other one, okay.
And it's called set ID format, right?
That's what I wrote. Yeah.
Okay.
Here, set ID format, activity ID format.
It should probably be called ID format because all the other methods that take it use that as a parameter name.
Yeah, might go for that.
Let me double check that though.
Yeah, I mean, even the argument is called ID format.
Yeah.
I think David just typoed it when he put the. I'm just gonna. Oh. Just see if I can edit this right up there at the top.
Well, I think you have a typo. You say I prefer this being a property.
Oh yeah. Well, as it turns out, my opinion is flexible. This being a property, I guess, but. All right. So then this is the next one.
I find it to see that.
It is.
Welcome. Apparently,
Have a cookie, have a seat.
You have cookies?
No. Only in the browser. I'm looking at the wrong thing, I think. Oh yeah, this is the one.
All right. I just edited it in the issue.
So I feel this one, we reviewed part of it before, I believe, right? So we reviewed the... Didn't I respond to that? I think I did, right?
Yeah, I think we marked it as needs more work.
Oh yeah, so...
You looked at it, you asked some questions, I answered those questions, then we didn't hear back.
Story of my life. So basically, let's go with the questions again. So display rate timescale is only derived type, presumably that's intentional, presumably the units aren't supposed to be parsed or localized. You currently can represent the units as a prefix versus suffix. Would you need this? The APIs and private callable compatibility. Can this be null? Should it be null? All right. Yeah, regarding nullability, like that's the kind of thing we're looking at right now while we're reviewing all of the stuff, and we have kind of all the patterns. So we have, sometimes it's null when it's null, sometimes we accept null, but then when you ask for it later, we return an empty string. It seems like for things like display name, empty string seems reasonable. Like, it seems weird to say we return null. I mean, unless you have a scenario where you want to differentiate null, meaning it's omitted from, oh, I really want it to be empty. If that is a meaningful distinction. But for the most part, null and empty string are treated the same.
Right. And this is a case where I don't feel like there's any meaningful distinction between null and empty string. Like, I don't know why you would want to explicitly set this thing to empty string. Other than you didn't set it at all.
Yeah. Does anybody any opinions one way or the other?
Regarding nullability?
The only opinion I have is when I saw the name of the property, DisplayUnits, I thought it was Boolean. I thought display was a verb.
In UI controls, like in WinForms, we tend to use the text suffix in such properties to clearly denote like this thing is going to be displayed to the user.
Units labeled or units like
Unix text.
I'm just my feedback of it was at DisplayUnits property. I'm like, oh, okay, this is a Boolean. I wonder what it controls. And then I saw it was a
I mean, I think I'd be fine with such a rename. I mean, we have some other properties on this thing that also have that display prefix on them.
Okay. If it matches,
we could change all of them at the same time.
Yeah, there's display name, there's display units, and there's display rate timescale. Right?
The other thing too is like you're only going to make the mistake once.
Yeah.
Which isn't the worst thing in the world.
Yeah.
It was just my snap feedback. I thought it was a Boolean.
And then we basically said we would mark it non-nullable. Is that fair?
That seems fine. I mean, we'd have to go make a few changes to, make that happen, but that seems like a fine plan.
What's the default return value of this property? Empty string?
It would be empty.
Right now it's null, but assuming we marked it non-nullable, it'd be empty string.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, on that one, the only question is, does it make sense that someone would want to say the empty string of I am self-descriptive and have no label, as opposed to somebody else should be providing a label for me? It does mean that whatever language can't express null, which is why we had the treat null and the empty string as the same thing. Guideline couldn't do that. It couldn't have null, but if it's the default, that's fine.
Yeah.
If you say no, it makes no sense, that's fine. The question has been asked today.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, certainly the way we're using it in our UI tool is like we have no capability of providing an alternate label. So if it's empty string, then you just get empty string.
Because I see in the field an indication has opted not to provide a default display. And I guess if I wanted it to be empty, I just give space, unless you're trimming it.
We may actually be trimming it. I don't recall, but
yeah, that's a scenario for.
But yeah, right now, I mean, if you wanted it to be empty, you would get the same result whether you gave us an empty string or if you gave us a null.
Oh.
We wouldn't try to do anything fancy and like guess a default if you don't provide one.
Okay. Non-nullable seems.
Right, then we're okay with that, I suppose.
And then we're sticking with display unit.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like the pattern you already have. Like
Yep, it's
agree
I
with
mean, it's
Levi,
definitely
like,
the pattern that's there. So I mean, I would either say stick with it or change the pattern all up.
If there's an existing pattern, like I agree with Levi's feedback of you would get confused once, and especially if there's another pattern, it probably makes sense in context. I withdraw my snap judgment.
All right.
Your snap judgment's right. It's just you would fix your code.
All right, timer count.
Yep. So we added a bunch of metrics for threading stuff, like for thread pool, thread count, pending work item count, etc. This is one more of those that someone asked for. So this will tell you the count of timers that are currently scheduled. The one thing I was thinking is, should we call it count or should we call it scheduled count? But otherwise, this allows you to track how many timers are currently scheduled over time and see if there's a constant increase to find leaks, or if there are just a large number of timers that are scheduled, may prompt.
How expensive and or thread safe is this property?
When we schedule and unschedule a timer, it's under a lock already, so it's just a matter of incrementing, decrementing something. It's not expensive at all.
So on a 64-bit process, this would be just a regular field rate.
So the count property will take a while because we have as many queues as there are processors. So we'll have to go through each queue, take the lock for the queue, add the count. But tracking the value, I think, is more important than.
But if the work it's doing is somewhat expensive, and in particular, if it's an anti-pattern to read it twice within the same method, unless you're looking for change, it should be a method instead of a property.
You know, the similar methods like the count on the thread pool that was added is properly too. I mean, it's the exact same correctness.
It's kind of implementation detail because
so,
we might implement.
Yeah, I agree with you, but you know, there's like.
I mean, if we've added that in
3.0,
we can fix it.
Yeah.
Well, but we also have the same thing, you know, even on some collections, accessing count isn't a read of a field, right? You iterate through a whole bunch of things to find the count. So it's not really any different than that.
Does that mean enumerating over such collections as O of n squared potentially?
Potentially.
If it had an index.
Or n log n, depending on which collection you're talking about. If you were saying, you know, I mean, if you were checking the count every time, I'm not sure why you.
Well, I can't think of a thing that would have an indexer in a non-O1 count property.
Yeah, that seems
Maybe that's
bad API design.
Well,
maybe
from
a
an
linked
API,
list.
From an API perspective, it's still a count. You may choose to optimize it. If that becomes important, and then you can make it more reasonable to be a property.
Well, the idea of property versus
this is very
method
much like
just cost.
this is very much like concurrent dictionaries count, which looks at each of it takes it's concurrent dictionary has an implementation detail, basically n buckets, each of which has a lock, and trying to get the count takes the lock for each and adds the values.
And just to clarify, this isn't a count of allocated timer instances. It's a count of timer instances that are currently scheduled to fire.
Well,
So,
wait, no.
No, because I believe once if you deschedule
this is
a
how
timer,
many-
isn't it
this is
still
how many-
scheduled? Sorry, go ahead, Steve.
Sorry, there are three possible things I think this could be tracking, and it's only one of them. You could imagine this was how many timers have been created over time, so it's monotonically increasing. It's not that. It could be how many timers have queued a work item to invoke the code, which I thought was what you were saying from Fire, and it's not that. What it is how many timers have been created and are still in the system. So if I say a new timer with a due time of a year, that's going to increment the count by 1.
But even if I deschedule the timer, if I remember correctly, the timer is actually still in the firing queue, correct? Because of the changes that were made in .NET Framework 4.5?
The whole implementation is different from .NET 4.5.
Okay.
So once a timer fires, if it's a non-repeating timer, and it hasn't processed the callback yet, and then it automatically gets descheduled, this count would not reflect that timer.
No, I guess my concrete question was, there was a performance optimization that was done a few years ago that said even if I deschedule a timer, it still remains in the queue because it's more expensive to remove it from the queue than it is to just let the overall active main timer fire and just ignore the callback. Steve, I think you're probably familiar with that optimization.
Yeah, but that's no longer how things are implemented.
Got it. Okay.
But yeah, I mean, our guideline is if the operation is orders of magnitude slower than a field access, it should be a method instead of a property. Like that's just reading the book. So I feel like it should be a method. If we've added similar things as statics on other types in this release, I would encourage us to change them in this month because it's the last time we can. And otherwise, if it's matching existing things already on the same type or things that are consistent with what we did in previous versions, then I won't push too strongly.
Is this just for diagnostics, or do you expect people might be able to enumerate the timer somehow?
You can't enumerate the timer.
One thing though that concerns me a bit is like the term right now is very generic and it's a static. You might find yourself in a spot where at some point you want to expose a property on the timer instance itself, or you want to have if you want to do a global enumeration, for example, then yeah, the count would probably be, what you would want to use in a for loop. In which case, like the design might be, the name would be unfortunate.
More sense to expose it on the thread pool.
I mean, that's also an option. I mean, if you make it a method and we call it like get scheduled timer count or whatever, but I don't think it matters one way or the other because the name is, sufficiently specific, I guess. So, because right now it's a very generic name.
What about what we did for GC, where we have a get GC memory info generic, like just an overall method, and it returns an info struct? Could this be a property on such an info struct if we had it hanging off a timer?
Yeah, that's my other question. Do you envision exposing more?
Well, that would make sense. The timer is like kind of a special thing that the thread pool deals with.
Right.
So if you wanted just to have the info struct, it probably should be on thread pool.
Right. I mean,
it's kind of there's difference between that and GC. In GC, you kind of want to get a snapshot that's consistent.
Right.
For this one, I don't ever care about consistent.
Because they're all independent values. Yep.
This would also be, I think, the only static. Maybe not.
I think it's the only static.
Before I commit that.
But I think you're right. It's the only static because the other things are all methods.
Although we did previously approve, but it hasn't been implemented, static create methods.
Yeah, because
the factory. Okay. I mean, that's a constructor, effectively.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, having it on thread. I mean, if it's for diagnostics, I don't think it matters one way or the other. Like, it's not a thing you expect most people to use ever, right?
Well, there are already diagnostics methods hanging off of thread pool, like get max and min threads, available threads, and so on.
Yep.
Right, on thread pool.
Yeah, on thread
not
pool.
on timer.
Yeah. If thread pool's thread count is the property you're mentioning that has the same, not quite 01 computation, then if we added thread pool dot scheduled timer count or whatever, then that seems like it's at least consistent and less in people's face. I think if you want the diagnostics, you'll look at thread pool, but if you just want to make a timer, like,
yeah,
why does IntelliSense tell me there's a count on this?
The API is to schedule a timer on timer class itself, so why should it be on the thread pool with a timer?
Yeah, also the only interaction timer has with the thread pool is when it fires, and most timers don't actually fire.
Because they get canceled?
Yeah. Yeah, if you're using it, I mean, well, that's not a fair statement on my part. Depends on the usage. There is a class of use of timer that's used for canceling operations, where you start a timer, you kick off an operation, and then if the timer fires, you cancel the operation. And the vast majority of cases, you start a timer for 90 seconds, and the operation completes in a millisecond, and you cancel the timer.
So if just out of curiosity, if I create a cancellation token and say cancellation token fires after X number of seconds, is that going to be reflected in this count?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, like, because on timer, right, the only thing that we have on system threading timer is create it, you change its interval, or you dispose it. Like, you don't schedule anything. You say timer. Like, thread scheduling is magic. You don't.
Timer.change is the schedule.
Yes, but the people who want timers don't understand, or usually don't understand the notion of thread scheduling and stuff. They're just like, there's this timer thing, it does magic.
The fact that Steve gave a positive answer for cancellation tokens also show up in this count makes me think that timer is just really not the right class for this count. Because it seems more of an app domain wide, like, number of things that are in queue to fire at some point in the future.
I mean, the reason, and it's an implementation detail, but the reason it would show up in this count is because cancellation token uses timer, and task.delay uses timer, and so it would show up here.
There's another system timer class.
Yeah.
That one also uses this.
Yes, but I was looking at its API. It's like, this doesn't look like the timer I'm familiar with.
All right, so then.
But so I understand what you're saying, Levi. At the same time, we have thread pool pending work item count, which reflects things that weren't queued with thread pool.
Yeah, and that's a fair point.
Well, it's the lower layer, right? I mean, if a higher level goes through the same lower level, of course it's reflected. I think that's generally fair.
Right, which is the same as timer.
Right.
Yeah.
But that's all I was saying.
So I mean, honestly, like, I don't care whether this goes in thread pool or timer per se, but if it goes in thread pool, property would make the most sense considering the other things on thread pool. If it's on timer, then I think either one would work. I would just encourage us to not call it count. I would probably go with, like, I don't know, scheduled count or something like that.
I agree with that.
I think if we were going to put it on thread pool, how many of these count properties did we add to thread pool? It's like 2 or 3, right?
We have 3. If completed
so
work item
make
count.
number 4. At that point, it does seem like we would do a thread pool, get whatever, counts or whatever the name is, and then it's got a bunch of properties off of it.
But the downside of that getting that thing is like you pay for everything, even if you care about one thing.
Yeah.
Right.
That's true. I guess my question would be, and this is a question for count, like the usage scenarios you see for this, if it's diagnostics, are people going to be getting all these anyway?
I think they'll probably get a few of them, if not all, but they may be getting them at different intervals.
Right.
So I want to leave that open to them. Like, one other way that could be done is we can maybe have a metrics subclass of thread pool that has the same static properties.
I think what Jan said earlier is important, right? I think things that you want to correlate, it should be on a combined struct, because that's the only way to get snapshot semantics, that they're, like, self-consistent, right? Things that are independent could be independent properties, because it's like, well, what do you care?
So if you're going to read even 2 of them at the same time, then avoiding entering and exiting all of the locks is probably
different blocks. Won't save you any.
That's implementation.
Because Jan, I think you can probably speak to the GC info struct, but if you're already calculating one of those pieces of data, at least on the GC info, getting all of the other ones is relatively free. Right? Is that why that type is designed as it is? Yeah. But you're saying that's not the case here, correct? Okay.
But even if it's not cheap, the problem is that these numbers relate to each other. So if you want them to use in a meaningful way, they have to be computed at the same time. Otherwise, you get, like, 2 different points in time, and then they don't make sense, right? Like.
Well, I think with this one, you said that you have to get the lock for each queue, so you're already going to have the potential for one queue to be counted, and then some of them to be fired, and therefore no longer be in the queue if you were to re-enumerate it. So this is really just like here's a best guess of the current state, so you can track. I think you said like whether you may be leaking a timer somewhere.
I mean, that's an implementation detail as well. If we really wanted it to be stable, we could take all the locks, then all the counts, and then release all the locks.
I don't know if that's important, though, to be honest.
I don't think it is. I just wanted to clarify that the implementation that count currently has could be changed.
Yeah.
There are other counts in the thread pool where it can be changed. We do the same sort of thing, but it would cost a lot.
Yeah.
So, I mean,
And
sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, presumably, even if you took all the locks, you still might get effectively tearing, where because you didn't take all the locks simultaneously, some operation was able to start after you began taking the locks that was able to grab one of the later locks and make a change of part of the state, and then you got it.
Right.
So from a consistency standpoint, I don't know that you've actually improved the situation, even if you grab all of them.
I'm not sure that's actually the case, but it doesn't matter either.
Okay.
There's nothing stopping us from adding this now and then saying in the future, like, oh, if we decide there's more relevant correlated information to give you, at that point we introduce the info method.
Right.
And maybe just obsolete this one at the same time.
Yeah, it's just unfortunate, right? But yeah, if you really cared.
It's a minor.
You know, these APIs are replacement for perf counters that we had like for the last 20 years. And, you know, the perf counters didn't give you consistent snapshot.
Right.
Nobody kind of said for learning.
Yeah, I'd agree. I think that's an unlikely outcome.
So with that, like, I would be fine with keeping this a property then, just for consistency. We would just need to name it something else.
Yep, let's call it schedule timer count then.
Is it on timer or thread pool?
Like the proposal, I think what I heard was on thread pool next to the completed work item count, pending work item count, thread count. It would be just schedule timer count.
If it's on thread pool,
I want to just re-mention my objection to that, and then I'll move on. Thread pool.scheduled timer count makes it sound like it's counting how many timers, like firing work items, are sitting in the thread pool.
I see. I can also go with timer, like as I said earlier, like my K level is super low.
Yeah,
like, either one works for me.
If we want to say that, you know, it makes sense on timer because it's tracking timers, but I would, if it's not sitting next to the not O1 properties on thread pool, that we should follow our property versus method guidance. And
But it could
it also
be made,
discourages someone from calling it multiple times within the same code unless they want to have different results. Because I think with a property, they expect it'll be the same if they read it multiple times.
it could be made O1 if we really wanted to.
Well, it could be kept a method made.
Yeah, but then that would still be a problem.
discussion.
Yeah, I mean, let's just agree on one thing and then move on. Like, okay, so given that it seems like what we want to do is put it on timer then. In which case, we can
Sorry, can I just make one thing with regards to O1? Like, the N here is number of processors, not number of timers.
Okay.
So, on a typical machine, you know, the N here is 4, 8, 16, which is practically O1.
Fair enough. Okay. Yeah, I mean, my bigger objection to it really is that if you look at it and you see that you're reading a property, and in the same method, usually reading the same property is the same result. And with this, it would be wildly different, or could be wildly different. I mean, that's true of any static because they reflect system state, but
right.
Well, environment take count. That's meant to change.
You would hope that it changes between.
also not really, yes, and datetime.utc now. Also not a really good example of us being good at properties versus methods.
But that's how it's
You're finding the warps. That's the problem.
All right,
You're
so
finding things that make us cringe.
where are we?
Timer,
Timer?
yes.
Timer, good.
Keep it a property and call it scheduled timer count or something.
Why would we invoke timer? Like, it's on timer, right? Timer.scheduled count seems
Sure.
reasonable.
What
Right?
about registered count? If scheduled sounds like they're scheduled to fire, what about registered count?
Works for me. Anything that's not count works for me.
Is it accurate?
As in the timer is registered, but hasn't fired yet.
Registered as in is active.
Yep.
Is the word active better than registered?
It makes sense to me. Does
Total
that make sense to
instance. I mean, just things that people understand what it means. Like,
Total also works.
I don't know what it means to schedule a timer. If I call never never, does that mean it's no longer scheduled, or is it scheduled just doesn't fire? If it's really the instance count, then active or instance or total or something.
Or running.
Yeah.
Instance sort of sounds to me like the number of timer objects rather than number of that have been registered.
I like active count.
Active works.
Yeah.
Active count. Awesome.
Yay.
Sorry, Jerry.
We agreed on one name. That is. We have 13 minutes left.
Thanks all.
All right, so then let's at least agree on the first one, because I don't think the other ones we have enough time for, because this one seems fairly straightforward.
Yes.
I would hope. So this is the property that, the attribute that the compiler currently code splits when you put a question mark somewhere or you activate nullability.
What? If you have a dictionary in question and will emit nullable attributes. This is similar to what we do for dynamic and also similar to what we do for triple names, where we're going to serialize here. There's 3 types nested, so there's going to be 3 positions. And there's 3 possible values, 0, 1, and 2. One is oblivious, one is nullable, and one is not nullable. Or it's annotated, sorry, annotated and not annotated. And so for each position, we walk from the top, starting on depth first, starting on the left. So this is a bang, this is a question, and this is 0. This is a format that we've been emitting, let's say, for the last 6 months. And based on feedback from Steven and BCL team, we're going to do some further optimizations on this, which are linked in the bottommost comments. And the general idea of the, that you had it.
Yeah, it's just, I don't know whether we read this now, but like.
The idea is to add 2 more attributes. One is nullable context. Nullable context, oh, sorry, I forgot to say. So here, if you had a dictionary, or list of string, so you have both of them are bang, essentially. You can put nullable and just use a single number.
Right.
And basically that means repeat it as many times as needed for all the positions. Along the same lines, if in a type, most members are using just bangs for everything, that's where the new attribute nullable context comes into play. And basically that's a way of setting a default for a certain scope. So now within that scope, you can just say nullable with a different value for changing. So this is basically a compiler optimizing the metadata kind of thing, where we can say within certain type, we've calculated that most of the defaults are bang or certain value.
Right.
So we'll be able to omit any occurrences of nullable bang. Within that scope, we don't have to emit that. We'll only emit when you actually have a divergence from the default. Okay. And then the third attribute, so again, based on feedback from the BCL team, there's a desire to not emit the nullable attributes and the nullable context attributes on private types and private members.
Right.
Or internal types and internal members, and that's a way basically to just shrink the size of the metadata that's produced. The problem with that is that we can't just do that all the time, because some people will want to look at metadata and internal members and so on via reflection or other. And therefore, we're proposing an attribute where you can configure that. Say I do want to include private members, or I want to include general members.
And so you could say have internals visible to, but strip from internals at the same time.
One feedback that we got on this API for the first one, the nullable, was that maybe instead of using bytes, we should be using an enum to give names to those 3 values. So we don't have to know 0 means this, 1 means that, and I'm open to that.
For attributes and enums, don't we normally expose constructors that take both the enum and the int, and then because it's serialized in IL as the int, then you have to know to reinterpret it as the appropriate. Is that right?
Good one.
I think attribute targets is done that way, for example.
But I mean, for previous attributes that were like that, we had, for dynamic, we had a bool, and the bool basically is, I think it's true for if it's dynamic, and if it's false if it's not.
Mm-hmm.
And true is not a very meaningful. We could have used an enum there, and we survived. Basically, I think that's very arcane. The number of people who would interact with attribute directly is super small. It's going to be emitted by the compiler, read by the compiler, and then there might be some reflection libraries or code that reads it. But because the encoding is fairly elaborate, I do not expect people to interact directly with this.
Like attribute usage, attribute only. Also,
yeah.
Because all enums are just stored as the number.
Yeah.
And then Emo had a question about does the compiler care about the storage? So we have a property for flags, or does the compiler only care about the constructor signature? And the answer is the compiler only cares about the constructors.
Right.
The reason we tend to include a field or a property is for reflection-based access to the information.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think making an enum makes sense once it's not being just injected by them.
But it is only being injected.
I thought that the purpose of this was that we would add it to compiler services and then it would be
Oh,
usable
sorry,
instead of...
it's not injected. It's only emitted by the compiler, but the type itself would become part of the BCL.
Right, because right now the compiler is just directly injecting the attribute in every assembly.
Yeah.
Sorry, yes, it's creating the type in the assembly and
then also using the type.
Yeah. So if we're making it a public attribute, then the byte should probably change to an enum if we want to make it an enum backed by byte for storage reasons. Then I assume that this is going to be an attribute that the compiler is going to yell at you and tell you that you can't manually declare.
Right.
So we don't
you can't use it.
So
we can't prevent you from using it in C#7.
So do you anticipate anybody ever consuming this attribute if they can't put it on the methods themselves since the compiler will yell?
Other compilers?
Yeah, but that's the reflection scenario.
Well, not an arousable number at that point.
Well, no, like if you declare it yourself using the square bracket, nullable, whatever, then the compiler will tell you that's a private attribute, don't set it.
Yeah.
You would still want to say, give me all the custom attributes of type nullable attribute because I want to go ask and answer the nullability question.
Okay.
So I think it makes sense to be a public type with enum, and then if you can't construct it, then we don't care about params on that. Because if people could do it manually, could conceivably have.
It also looks like the ones that take int and stuff are mostly in interop services, so that's probably why.
Yeah, so that would be my...
I really think the enum is worth it. It seems to me it's like bordering on over-engineering.
I mean,
I think
there would be two reasons we're putting this in the BCL. One is so that we reduce the size of every assembly, but the declaration of this type within the assembly isn't really going to be significant, so I don't think we care. The other would be we're adding it for reflection, in which case we should have names so that they don't have to go look up what the document.
But if we're adding it for reflection, isn't there a whole other proposal about being able to actually comprehend the nullability of various things? Isn't that what like 2 tabs over is?
Yeah, I think that honestly, like the reflection argument is not that strong in my viewpoint because the flags is the least of your concern, right? Like it's the whole.
The coding is.
How do you how do you even get the index, right? That's the hard part. And then the next question is how do you incorporate that in, with the compression proposal that the compiler team has with context switching and other things, right? So the policy there.
My other concern with the enum is I don't know if that would introduce a break from anybody who's been using the preview so far, switching from byte to enum.
Well, you are going to break the encoding anyway. This context thing.
Yeah, but existing assemblies would be readable by the new compiler.
I thought the proposal was that it's not. That's what Chuck wrote.
The existing encoding we can still read it. It's unoptimized. But so the new compiler produces optimized format, knows how to read optimized format, but it means it can also read unoptimized format. I have to double check. But
point of previews is that we can kind of
we can break
things.
Yeah.
You could also explicitly size the enum to byte, right?
Sure, and does that mean then the transition is a no-op kind of thing?
If they read the field, they'd have to cast the indexer.
Yeah.
If they wanted it back to byte.
Is this attribute intended to be mutable once created?
No, it's not. It's just that seems like weird to have a read-only collection of bytes.
Read-only span?
It's not necessarily that. So we have two categories of attributes in the framework, right? One of them takes all of their parameters in the constructor, and all of the properties are immutable once you read them, because it's type, string, int, and so on.
That's the case.
This is mutable in the sense that you can change the values after it's been constructed, which means if you're caching these things, such as might be common in reflection-based APIs, somebody who changes a value could cause problems.
Like I returns read-only span of byte flags.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Just have the property expose read-only span and have it a private field, and then unless someone's using unsafe, you're good.
They want to do they call to array.
Read-only span of byte is actually a good idea.
Yeah,
do we actually expose that? Do we actually have read-only span of bytes properties like anywhere else in the reflection APIs?
I don't think we do yet.
Great. There's always a first time.
We haven't.
But to be fair, like the reflection part is they just call activate a create instance on the attribute.
And I mean, like
from now on, it's just a normal type.
In practice, no one's going to change this. I'm just trying to be defensive.
If we think that
read-only span seems
if we think that there's no scenario for reading this, then why don't we just let the compiler keep injecting the type into every DLL?
Size.
Yeah, and type it slows the type loader.
Yeah, I was I assume that the size of an attribute is on the order of 0.
It's reading the attributes.
Only when someone calls get custom attributes.
Or when the type loader has to load all the types and then look at the attributes.
Yeah, it means every assembly will have
some copy.
I
mean, you basically have to do string comparisons at that point, right, for everything. But like that, I mean, you only have to basically find the type once per assembly, and then you can do optimized comparisons.
So I prefer sticking with the byte array because of consistency with previous attributes that were in.
Well, we are not really consistent. Like the other one, the dynamic one, for example, exposes ilist of byte, which I don't know what it does. Presumably, I don't think it wraps the array. I haven't checked, but like this is one of those things where we're not super consistent in the BCL. I think span is fine. It's the cheapest thing we can do. And given that nobody should ever care, it probably doesn't matter one way or the other. And if they really care, at least they can get access to them. I don't know. It seems to me like weird to emit the thing all the time if in practice we can just have an attribute.
I think that if we're going to make the attribute type public, we should make the enum so that we remember what the values mean, instead of the compiler is the only one who knows what the values mean.
To me, that seems largely unrelated, but...
I mean, if we're exposing the attribute as public, that means someone can call it, which means we should tell them what the answer is.
Yeah, I don't know. Are the compiler guys able to do that? If you make that in enum?
I mean, all that they have to write down in the IL is...
It's a little bit of change. I'm not excited about doing that change because of the time crunch number.
Once we have this attribute, is the path that M is the attribute like copies of the attribute in random places, is it going to be disabled, or is that?
No,
still
we
going
will
to be
keep it around. So
Okay.
we will inject the type.
So that means that they, like the reflections still have to compare names. That it cannot.
Fair enough. All right, I guess. Oh, you can just-
Yeah. I mean, Jan is an argument, right? If we basically always end up injecting the attribute, then the question really is, what's the benefit? Because we always have to handle both cases, then we might as well just only handle one case.
Yeah, you cannot do kind of type of this attribute, give me the thing. Always have to do give me the attribute. So
yeah, sort of the thing I was saying of why would we make it public? And I like Jan's argument of if we're going to be in a mixed universe, then I think that's worse than it's just always injected into each sentence.
I can live with that. I mean, we can reopen the discussion. I mean, like right now, what we would do is you would just make a public API if its data compiler doesn't have to code split, and we can still do this later, right?
Sure.
I'd be okay with that.
We can delay. But it's good that we reviewed the API, because the compiler emits a certain shape. We want that shape to be the consumption.
Yeah, I mean, in general, we just have a problem with anything that has a array property because our rules are it should be implemented in order to returning a copy, and so if we just start saying this is a projection, you get the read-only span, then that's saves on the copy, still gives it as an indexable property. And Jan and Co work really hard at making span fast.
All right, so then let's do this.
That's it.
That's it.
Thank you.
All right, guys. Thanks, guys, online. I now have to switch rooms.
Oh, yeah, don't you have to like switch buildings?
You have to switch buildings, yes.
Eric smugly shows up for whatever meeting he has in this room.
Smart.